keep looking at me that way, and I'll give in," she whispered, and in that single glance, I realized I'd been lost to her all along. The first time I met her, I felt immediately out of my depth. Moving into the old apartment building had been a practical decision. I needed a place close to work, affordable and quiet. I didn't expect the landlady to make such an impression. She was standing in the dimly lit hallway, casually leaning against the doorframe of her office, arms crossed, a half-smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a way that made her presence quietly magnetic. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling softly around her face, and there was a calm confidence in the way she carried herself. Yet, behind that poise, I sensed a hint of vulnerability, something unspoken that made her human, approachable. "Welcome," she said, extending a hand as she handed me the keys to my apartment. Her fingers brushed mine briefly, and I felt a warmth linger, a tiny spark that made my pulse skip. I realized immediately that this was the kind of touch that lingered in memory long after it had passed. I tried to focus on the simple mechanics of taking the keys, but I caught her eyes, a shade of hazel I couldn't quite define, and felt like she was reading something about me without a word spoken. Her voice had a soft teasing quality as she asked me routine questions: where I worked, if I had lived in the city long, what brought me here. But there was an undercurrent in her tone, an unspoken amusement, that suggested she knew I was nervous. I found myself answering cautiously, yet grateful for the warmth behind her words. There was something about the way she watched me, not judging, but observing curiously, something that made me want to reveal more of myself than I usually would. I noticed little things that set her apart from any other person I'd met: the faint scent of vanilla and sandalwood clinging to her clothes, the way her fingers tapped lightly on the keys as if impatient with some private thought, the subtle curve of her lips when she smiled. Every small gesture was intimate without being overt, drawing my attention like a quiet magnet. Even her footsteps, soft against the worn wooden floors, seemed measured, deliberate, a rhythm I found myself unconsciously matching. As I moved into my new apartment later that day, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. I realized I was already anticipating seeing her again, not out of necessity, but because there was a comfort in her presence, and a thrill in the subtle tension of knowing she noticed me more than anyone else had in a long time. That day, nothing overt happened, no romantic gestures, no declarations. But the connection was there, fragile yet undeniable, like the first spark of a flame that might one day grow into something consuming. It was in these quiet, unremarkable moments that the slow dance of attraction began, and I had a feeling, one I couldn't yet name, that life in this old apartment building was about to become anything but ordinary. I hadn't expected to see her again so soon. That afternoon, the sunlight spilling through the courtyard lit the world in gold, and I was carrying a small package to the apartment when I rounded the corner, and there she was. She had that same effortless grace, standing with one hand resting lightly on the railing, the other holding a cup of coffee. Her eyes found mine instantly, and a tiny smile tugged at the edge of her lips, like she'd been waiting just to see me. "Hello again," she said, her voice carrying that soft, teasing quality I couldn't shake from my thoughts. It wasn't a greeting so much as a gentle challenge. I felt my chest tighten, a nervous thrill settling over me. I realized I was caught somewhere between the urge to act casual and the urge to lean closer, to step into the warmth that seemed to radiate from her. We fell into easy conversation, though the tension beneath our words hummed quietly. She asked how the move had gone, and I found myself sharing more than I intended. Little stories about boxes I couldn't find room for, the stubborn old radiator that rattled at night, even a small, silly complaint about the stairs. She listened, leaning slightly toward me, and every so often our hands would brush. Just a fleeting touch on the coffee cup, the softest pressure, as she nudged me to see something more clearly. But the electricity in those touches lingered, a quiet pulse that made my heart rate jump without either of us speaking it aloud. There was something intoxicating about the way she observed me. Not in a scrutinizing way, but as if she could read the tiniest flickers of emotion behind my expressions, the small hesitation when I laughed, the way my eyes darted to the ground when I felt embarrassed. And I noticed, too, that she seemed to enjoy it. A playful tilt of the head, a soft chuckle when I fumbled over my words, the faint brush of her fingers against mine as she pointed toward the gate. It was subtle, unspoken, yet loaded with an intimacy I couldn't deny. At one point, a breeze swept through the courtyard, lifting her hair gently across her face. I found myself reaching instinctively, tucking a stray strand behind her ear, and the warmth of her skin under my fingers made my stomach twist in a delicious tension. She didn't pull away. Instead, she held my gaze, and for a brief moment, the world outside the courtyard faded. Just the two of us, connected by a handful of gestures, a few words, and 1,000 unspoken thoughts. When she finally laughed, a soft, genuine sound that carried across the courtyard, I realized I was grinning like an idiot, aware of it, and yet unable to stop. She tilted her head again, that playful warning in her eyes, and I understood. She was aware of the effect she had on me, and she enjoyed it. And in that enjoyment, I felt myself drawn further in, unable to resist the slow pull of fascination, curiosity, and something that felt dangerously like desire. By the time we parted that day, I wasn't just anticipating seeing her again, I was craving it. Each glance, each touch, had planted a seed I knew would grow, quietly but insistently. And somewhere deep down, I realized that my life in this apartment, my ordinary daily routines, had become impossibly intertwined with the warmth and the magnetic presence of her gaze. After our encounter in the courtyard, everything seemed charged with a new, subtle energy. I started noticing her in moments I hadn't expected, walking past her apartment door, hearing her voice in the hallway, catching her reflection in a window as I carried groceries. Each time, my attention seemed drawn to her almost instinctively, like some quiet gravitational pull. She noticed too, though never directly calling me out, letting our interactions stretch a fraction longer than necessary, testing boundaries with gentle humor and small, deliberate gestures. One evening, as I returned from the nearby cafe, I found her in the hallway, rearranging the small potted plants that lined the windowsill. She glanced up, and our eyes met, lingering a beat longer than politeness required. I stopped, pretending to fumble with my keys, and she smirked faintly, that familiar teasing glint in her hazel eyes. "You're taking your time," she said softly, her voice low enough that only I could hear. It was playful, yet carried an undercurrent of expectation. I guess I got distracted," I murmured, aware of the subtle tension in the space between us. As I stepped closer, our shoulders brushed, and the warmth of her proximity sent a shiver through me. There was no urgency, no declaration, just the brush of fabric, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the scent of the old wooden floors. My heart thudded against my chest, yet her expression remained composed, almost serene, as if nothing were happening at all, and that only heightened the intensity of the moment. We fell into an easy silence, standing side by side, arranging the plants together. Our hands occasionally met, brushing over the leaves, lingering just a second longer than necessary. Each accidental touch felt deliberate, a language of its own. When her hand slid against mine, I could feel the quiet steadiness of her pulse, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined she felt the same flutter I did. Even in casual conversation, there was an intimacy growing, unspoken yet palpable. She asked about my day, commented on small victories or frustrations I hadn't thought to share with anyone else. I listened too, noticing the tiny ways she moved, how her fingers traced the edge of a pot, the subtle tilt of her head when she laughed, the warmth of her gaze resting on me without ever pressing too hard. It was mesmerizing. By the end of that evening, I realized that my awareness of her presence had become something unavoidable. The apartment, once simply a place to live, was now a stage for subtle glances, quiet touches, and unspoken words. There was a tension between us that neither of us needed to name, yet it thrummed beneath every interaction. That night, lying in my small bedroom, I replayed every glance, every touch. The hallway had become a theater of anticipation, the small rituals of daily life transformed into moments charged with silent meaning. I understood, in that quiet reflection, that what was building between us was no longer just curiosity. It was the delicate, intoxicating pull of something far more profound. A slow, deliberate gravity that neither of us could resist, and one I was both eager and nervous to surrender to. It happened on a day when the sky had been gray since morning, the clouds heavy and low. I was heading out to run an errand when the first drops began to fall. By the time I reached the courtyard, the rain had thickened, turning the quiet streets into a blur of reflections and rippling puddles. And there she was, waiting, or perhaps just moving with the same erratic rhythm as the storm. Our eyes met immediately, and I saw that small, teasing smile I'd come to recognize, the one that made my pulse skip every time. "You're soaked," I blurted, though I barely noticed the rain on my own clothes. "I could say the same to you," she replied, her voice warm and light, carrying a hint of amusement. There was no shelter nearby, only a small shared umbrella I could hold above us. I stepped closer, and she didn't hesitate to let me cover half her frame with mine. The umbrella was small, our shoulders brushed, and I felt the warmth of her side against mine, the rain dripping from the edge of the canopy onto our shoes. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. And then, before I could overthink it, I found myself admitting aloud what I'd been feeling for weeks. The strange, magnetic pull I couldn't ignore, the way her presence had become the highlight of my days. She listened, her eyes searching mine, the corners of her lips softening into that teasing, knowing curve. "Keep looking at me that way," she murmured, barely audible over the patter of rain, "and I might just give in." My heart thudded, a mix of exhilaration and fear. The words weren't a confession, not entirely, but they carried weight. She was acknowledging the tension between us, teasing it, inviting it, and yet holding the reins with quiet control. I realized how careful she was, how gracefully she balanced the line between temptation and propriety. And it only made me want her presence more, the way she seemed both untouchable and dangerously near at the same time. Our hands brushed under the umbrella, tentative at first, then lingering as if we were both testing boundaries. The small contact was electric, warm, familiar, intimate. I could feel the pulse of her wrist beneath my fingers, and the steady rhythm of her breathing, close to mine. For a fleeting second, it was as though the rest of the world had dissolved. The rain, the gray sky, the distant sounds of the city all faded away, leaving only the quiet intensity of two people standing shoulder to shoulder, suspended in a moment they weren't ready to name. When we finally reached the safety of the building's overhang, both of us soaked but unwilling to let go, she laughed softly. It wasn't a triumphant laugh, but one of acknowledgement, a quiet surrender to the thrill of the tension we had created together. I stepped back reluctantly, aware of the small space between us, and she tilted her head, giving me that sly, intimate look that made every nerve in my body hum with anticipation. That day, the rain did more than soak our clothes. It washed away the hesitation that had held us apart, leaving behind a raw, unspoken truth. We were no longer simply landlady and tenant, no longer strangers navigating polite boundaries. Something profound had begun, subtle yet undeniable, a slow, irresistible pull neither of us could deny. After the rain-soaked encounter, the air between us had changed. Even in the ordinary routines of the apartment building, our interactions carried an unspoken weight. That afternoon, I had come up to help with something, just a small chore, she had said. But the moment I stepped into her apartment, I realized that small chore would be an excuse for more than that. She was in the kitchen, standing by the counter, light from the window glinting across her hair. The scent of freshly brewed tea and faint vanilla lingered in the air, a warm, intimate contrast to the chill left by the rain outside. "Thanks for helping," she said casually, though the tone suggested she was glad for my company more than the work itself. I moved to assist her, and our hands met over a bowl of ingredients. The touch was accidental, a soft brush that neither of us pulled away from immediately. I could feel the quiet steadiness of her hand against mine, and the subtle warmth spread through me in a way that made it impossible to focus solely on the task at hand. She caught my gaze with that same teasing curiosity, her eyes glinting as though aware of the effect our closeness had on both of us. As we worked side by side, our movements began to synchronize naturally. She handed me utensils with a gentle touch on my wrist. I brushed a stray crumb from her sleeve, lingering longer than necessary. There was a rhythm developing between us, silent, intimate, and yet completely safe. Every small gesture carried a charge, though it was muted by the ordinary context of preparing something together. At one point, she stepped close to reach a jar on the top shelf, and I instinctively moved behind her, steadying her gently. The warmth of her back pressed briefly against my chest, her hair brushing my cheek, and for a suspended moment, I felt the tenderness I hadn't anticipated. She turned slightly, enough to meet my eyes, and there was a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes: trust, closeness, the quiet acknowledgement of what was between us. Later, we moved to the small balcony, carrying the tea. The city sprawled before us, lights beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. We didn't speak immediately, letting the quiet stretch, enjoying the shared space. She leaned against the railing, and I stood close, aware of her presence more than any conversation. When our hands brushed against the cups simultaneously, our fingers intertwined naturally, and I felt the simple, profound comfort of her trust. By the end of the evening, I realized that these private moments, touches that lingered, glances that held unspoken meaning, shared silences, had become the most significant part of my day. The attraction wasn't just physical or fleeting, it was emotional, grounded in a deepening awareness of each other's presence and vulnerability. The slow-burn tension had shifted into something warmer, more intimate, yet still restrained by unspoken understanding. As I left her apartment, carrying a sense of fulfillment that made the world outside feel muted, I knew this was only the beginning. The quiet rituals, the lingering touches, the shared glances, they were building something delicate but unbreakable. And even as I walked down the hall, I could feel the pull to return, to stand near her again, to exist in those small, suspended moments where nothing needed to be said for everything to be understood. It was one of those evenings that seemed to arrive without warning, carrying a quiet significance that neither of us could ignore. The city outside was settling into its nighttime rhythm, lights twinkling in the distance, while a gentle hush filled her apartment. We had decided to cook together, a spontaneous plan that started with the simplest of intentions. She needed help with dinner, and I had offered. But the ordinary task quickly became something charged, something more intimate than either of us anticipated. We moved around the kitchen in comfortable synchronicity, passing utensils and ingredients with touches that lingered just slightly longer than necessary. Every accidental brush of her hand against mine, every small laugh over a minor mishap, felt amplified by the underlying tension that had been building between us for weeks. I caught myself watching the way her hair fell over her shoulder, how the soft light from the kitchen lamp played across her features, and I realized that I had memorized these details without even trying. As we settled at the small balcony with our plates, the city sprawling beneath us, the conversation slowed. Words became secondary to presence. I noticed her fingers tracing the rim of her cup absent-mindedly, and I reached across, letting my hand cover hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the touch, tilting her head toward me slightly, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed by anyone else. The warmth of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her hand in mine, and the soft brush of her hair against my arm created a closeness that was almost unbearable in its intensity. I'm glad you're here," I said quietly, letting the words slip without overthinking. There was a sincerity in my voice that surprised even me. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw her vulnerability fully, not just the playful teasing or the quiet confidence she often displayed, but the woman who had lived, who had loved and lost, who now allowed herself to be seen by me. "I'm glad you're here too," she murmured, her voice carrying both warmth and an almost imperceptible tremor. We talked then, not about the city, not about errands, not about casual matters, but about ourselves. About fears, regrets, hopes, and small, secret joys. The conversation flowed with a trust that felt new and thrilling, an intimacy built from weeks of quiet observation, lingering glances, and unspoken understanding. Every laugh, every shared sigh, every pause seemed to draw us closer, as if the world outside had shrunk to the tiny balcony where we sat, two people daring to be honest with one another. At one point, she leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. The weight was gentle, unforced, yet it carried a significance that made my heart swell. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the subtle warmth of her presence wrapped around me like a blanket. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply exist there, with her, in the quiet perfection of the evening. By the time the night deepened, we both knew that something profound had shifted. The slow burn attraction, the tension, the unspoken desire, it had transformed into something tangible yet tender. The age gap, the propriety, the hesitations, all of it melted away in the warmth of shared trust and emotional honesty. That night, under the soft glow of city lights and gentle conversation, we had crossed into a space where closeness and vulnerability could exist safely, beautifully, and completely. The days that followed our shared evening felt lighter, yet charged with a comforting familiarity. The apartment building, once merely a place to live, had transformed into a world where every hallway, every doorway, every quiet corner seemed to hum with memory and possibility. The tension that had once defined our interactions had softened into a gentle intimacy, a closeness that neither needed to be named aloud to exist fully. Mornings became my favorite part of the day. I'd pass her door on the way to the mailbox, and she'd be there with a cup of coffee in hand, soft morning light spilling over her features. Our eyes would meet, and a small, knowing smile would pass between us, quiet but full of meaning. Sometimes she would hold the cup out toward me, a silent invitation to linger for a moment, and I would accept, savoring the warmth of her hand brushing mine, the faint scent of vanilla and tea that clung to her. Those small gestures had become the new language of our connection, gentle yet electric, casual yet profound. We continued sharing subtle touches and glances throughout our days. A hand resting lightly on my shoulder as she leaned to examine a package, a quiet laugh over a minor accident in the hallway, fingers brushing as we reached for the same book in the small lobby. Each touch, each shared look, felt deliberate in its unspoken communication, a slow weaving of trust and affection that only deepened our bond. Even ordinary moments carried weight now. One evening, she invited me to sit on the balcony with her, the city spread below us in a mosaic of lights. We didn't speak much at first, letting the quiet wrap around us like a comfortable blanket. When she leaned against my arm, resting her head lightly on my shoulder, I felt an overwhelming sense of rightness, as if we had both found the place we were meant to occupy in each other's lives. The age gap, the hesitations, the silent caution we had exercised, all of it mattered less than the warmth and trust that had grown between us. We began to understand the beauty of our relationship in these quiet rhythms. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the steady, unforced closeness that comes from knowing someone fully and being known in return. The subtle flirtations, the teasing glances, the gentle touches had evolved into a profound comfort, a love built on mutual respect, understanding, and emotional intimacy. By the end of the week, it felt natural to exist in this shared space of warmth. We passed each other in the hallway and lingered a little longer than necessary, shared casual dinners that stretched into hours of conversation, and exchanged soft smiles that carried more meaning than words could capture. Every interaction reinforced the quiet truth: we were a part of each other's lives now, in a way that was steady, tender, and undeniably real. As I left her apartment one evening, I paused in the doorway, looking back at her. She smiled, that same soft, confident smile, and I felt a sense of profound peace. The slow burn attraction, the quiet tension, the moments of hesitation, all had blossomed into something enduring. And in that moment I knew we had found not just romance, but connection, intimacy, and a warmth that would linger in every hallway, every glance, every touch from that day forward.